Hi everyone, I'm Maggie McGrath, Senior Editor at Forbes. The number of children with disabilities is increasing every year. In the 2022 to 2023 school year, 7.5 million kids were enrolled in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Here to talk about the families who are financially planning for these children is financial planner Melissa Weisz. Melissa, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Maggie. Thank you for having me.
I just said the number of children with disabilities seems to be going up year after year, and you are a financial planner with a special certification. You are specifically a chartered special needs consultant. What is that, and how did you get into this work?
So I started my career as an analyst. I became a certified financial planner and then a chartered financial analyst, and then I had children. And in the course of having my children, my older son, we learned over the years, is on the autism spectrum and has some other learning disabilities and ADHD. And so really I came to the Chartered Special Needs Consultant designation from a very selfish perspective. I wanted the knowledge for myself so that I could make my own plan. I really didn't want to leave any stone unturned. And I don't think that that's right for every family. Some families are like me. They want to be the expert and they want to plan for themselves. And for other people, they want to have a support team. I do actually have my own support team. But it was really important to me that I understood the ins and outs of the planning that was going to be required. And then it just became a sort of natural next step to share the information that I have with the rest of the world.
So who are your clients, and what are the types of disabilities that these families are navigating?
So I do work with a broad range of clients. Some of my clients come to me and they may have a child who has Down syndrome. They may have a child who is on the autism spectrum. Oftentimes there are comorbidities with autism spectrum disorder. We also see instances of mental health. I feel like that has really been on the increase as well, and even addiction.
You mentioned a variety of conditions there: Down syndrome, autism spectrum, mental health disorders, addiction. Can you talk about the financial strain or financial picture that your clients are coming to you when they first talk to you?
Yeah, so most of our clients are high net worth, oftentimes self-made, either business owners, corporate executives, physicians, right? And so they have worked very hard and saved diligently while caring for a child who has a disability. And I think that sometimes what happens is, we get our children through school and there are entitlements of services that you can get through school, and then children age out of that, and then it becomes, the so-called services cliff of what do we do now and what does adulthood look like for my child? Are they going to be able to work? Are they going to need to live with me or to need some sort of residential placement, and what does my retirement look like at that point? So what I like to tell people, especially when they're very early on in the planning, is you do have to put on your own oxygen mask first and make sure that despite the financial drain of medical treatment, evaluations, special education schools that sometimes you can get paid for through a school district, and sometimes you're on your own, right? It really just depends. There's an enormous amount of advocacy that goes into figuring out what services are going to be available for your child. And so you have to sort of wade through all of that, but at the same time make sure that you are, to the extent that you can, doing the traditional savings that you should be doing so that you can retire, so that you can provide for your child long term. So maxing out 401ks and Roth IRA planning and making sure you have life insurance. I mean, a lot of that sort of personal financial planning is not all that different from what we would tell someone else. I think what's different is the sort of runway, because for a lot of younger families, they're planning for college, right? And then once we get past college, then we're in our peak earning years. We're going to save, and we're going to be able to retire. But for families who have a loved one who may or may not be able to support themselves, your runway becomes much, much longer. And so having that savings discipline and that budgeting discipline becomes all the more important. But then you've got these sort of non-negotiable expenses when it comes to caregiving that you have to make sure you navigate as well.
You just raised so many questions, and it occurs to me through talking to friends who are navigating this with their own families that there are so many unknowns. And I kind of want to go through the life stage. If someone has a 2-year-old, for instance, who has been diagnosed as having autism, this 2-year-old is still developing. If you don't know how able this child will be to care for themselves as an adult, how do parents plan for that now?
That is a great question. And every child is unique, right? Regardless of if they have a disability or they don't, we don't know what the future is going to hold for our children. We wish for the best, and maybe in some circumstances we have to plan for maybe not what we had envisioned for our child, right, when we became pregnant and first had them. Early on in life, early intervention services can be very, very helpful and impactful. I've seen how impactful they can be to families, and they can be a great resource as well, with helping with things like, physical, PT, OT, speech therapy. There are a lot of resources there. And then you go into school and you have your individualized education programs and IEPs, and you can get speech therapy and OT, and maybe they can be in an inclusion classroom, maybe they're going to be in a special education setting, maybe they will be in an out-of-district placement in a specialized school environment. The good thing is that under the law, our children have protection. They are entitled to a public education. And so if your school district can't provide what they need in the district, then they have to provide you with those resources. The rub is that whether or not they can provide it or not can become a very, very messy sort of situation to navigate, where you want to make sure, we talk about building a team during those early years. When you're navigating an IEP, make sure you have either an advocate or an education attorney so that you understand what your rights are and what your children's rights are.
So as a financial planner, are you also working with lawyers or education advocates to kind of create a cohesive plan for your clients?
Yeah, so as a certified financial planner, part of our training is to be in the hub, in the middle with our clients, right? Not everybody does it, or not everybody does it the same way. The traditional team structure is you've got your advisor who's going to help you day to day make your important financial decisions, and maybe you have an insurance person, and maybe you have an accountant, and maybe you have an attorney, and then your advisor is there with you and should be helping you to kind of navigate and bring all those spokes together, at the middle of the wheel. When you're doing disability planning, there are just going to be some more spokes, and it might be an education attorney who, maybe as a financial advisor, I don't have to be involved in the legal process of where they're going to go to school, but it's good to have a relationship with the attorney to understand, do you think that you're going to file for due process, or do you think that they're going to get an out-of-district placement? What is their financial contribution going to be? Right, and working with their accountant to make sure that they know what deductions are available. And I think a lot of times it's just consciousness raising within the different team members, because families also may not share with their accountant that they have a child who has a disability, and they went to a conference and the accountant doesn't know that would be a deduction.
Oh, interesting. Now, you mentioned insurance, and I also want to talk about what broadly what families should know about insurance when they have a child with a disability, but I also want to ask you about something called a special needs trust. Mm-hmm. What is a special needs trust, and do all families who are caring for a loved one with a disability need one?
Okay. Good question. So a special needs trust, there are actually a couple different varieties of special needs trusts.
We can break them down.
There are first-party special needs trusts, which are typically going to be funded with the person's own money. So let's say you have an individual who's disabled who, very well-intentioned grandparent leaves them, a portion of their estate. Well, now they've inherited money. That can disqualify them from means-tested public benefit programs like Medicaid, like SSI, supplemental security income, Medicaid waiver programs, probably most importantly. And so those types of first-party special needs trusts can be used and funded to preclude, so that they don't lose access to those public benefits. And the rub with those first-party special needs trusts is that they are subject to Medicaid payback. So to the extent that you do receive services, there's going to be a lien on that essentially. So that's one type of special needs trust. They can also be used with legal settlements. In the event there's an accident, and then there's a payout that's to be received because of an accident that leads to an injury and a disability. The next type of special needs trust is called a third-party special needs trust. That's a special needs trust that we work oftentimes with attorneys and high net worth families, because that's the type of vehicle that's funded not by the person with a disability, it's funded by somebody else, right? And so if well-intentioned grandma or well-intentioned mom and dad are planning to leave funds to their child, well, they can establish a third-party special needs trust that is used to supplement public benefits. And so it can be used to fund a lot of different types of expenses. There are two categories you have to be really careful with. Those are food and shelter expenses. But outside of those, special needs trusts, because Medicaid will ignore them in terms of qualifying, as long as you're very careful with the types of distributions that you make and to whom. You can leave money to a child who's disabled who needs to have a financial means tested qualification for Medicaid and Medicaid waiver programs. But those are really going to be subsistence level, right? That's maybe not the lifestyle that you want for your child, but you want them to be able to access whatever programs might be available through your state, but you still want to be able to support them so that they can have clothing and they can take a vacation or have entertainment, have electronics, whatever it is that you would want to be supplementing that they're not getting from public benefits. And then the last type of special needs trust is a pooled special needs trust, and those are typically going to be administered by a nonprofit. And so those are typically appropriate when you have a smaller special needs trust that you're looking to establish, because it's going to be a lot less administratively burdensome, right? There's no tax returns that you're going to be responsible for, and establishing the documents, and it's going to be a lot simpler and low cost. But typically, with a pooled special needs trust, anything that's left in the special needs trust after your child's passing is going to stay with the charity, right? Nice. Versus with a third-party special needs trust, you get to name the remainder beneficiary. And so if you have, maybe it's a charity, maybe it's a sibling, maybe it's a cousin who is helping, and you want to make sure that you leave whatever's left to that remainder person, you have the ability to dictate that with a third-party special needs trust. Now, after having said all of that, these are really important trusts to incorporate into your planning. They are not necessarily right in every single circumstance. Right. Okay, but there are also attorneys who specialize in this area who can build out some flexibility to at least give a trustee the option to fund the special needs trust, or perhaps fund a support trust, because you don't know what's going to happen in the future, right? Maybe my child is actually able to work. They're not going to be eligible for Medicaid. They're not going to be eligible for SSI. But they're not going to be quite where they need to be to have the lifestyle, that we'd like them to be able to maintain. So we just want to supplement in that way without all the complexity, right, of the special needs trust. And so you can you can plan, I think, with some flexibility, but you do have to have an attorney who's able to help navigate that, because it's very, very specific planning that can go wrong if you don't do it properly.
I was just about to say, everything you're saying about estate planning and the benefits, it's financial, but it also comes down to the legal system and knowing those rules and procedures. And it's so complicated, and I'm thinking about the bevy of appointments that families have to maintain, either at the beginning of a diagnosis or sometimes throughout a child's life, depending on the disability that they have. For families who are feeling so overwhelmed by the care that they are providing and they are just maxed out with time, and they say, yeah, special needs trust, great, absolutely, sounds wonderful, literally don't have a second to spare.
It's on my to-do list.
Right. Well, what do you say?
Yeah.
Because you can't create time out of thin air.
You know, it's not just with families who struggle with a disability. I think everybody's busy, and there are, clients who are also very busy who we just have to kind of, unfortunately, scare them a little bit. What happens if something happens to you and you haven't made a plan? Well, if you're not the one who's going to decide the plan for your child, then the court is going to decide. And so you have to take that power, and yes, no one is going to be better than you, but you choosing, right, what's likely to happen, you creating the memos detailing what works for your child, everything down to, how do they like to celebrate their birthday? Where do they like to go on vacation? What are their different rituals that are really important to maintain for them? What medications have they tried that they're allergic to or just really don't work, and what's worked really well, right? Who are their important relationships in their life? Creating that system of documents, both the informal information about your child's life, but then also the very formal legal trust and estate planning work. You are caring for your child in doing that. And if you don't, you're exposing them to be sort of subject to decision making that you may or may not agree with.
The other aspect of all those doctor's appointments that can come is the cost that falls on these families that have a child with a disability. And I think it is pretty common to feel like there's no leftover money to save. Where do you start if you feel like you've been spending every last penny on your child's medical care, but you also know that you need to leave them with some kind of savings cushion for if and when they need it and you are not in the picture?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge fan of tracking. I think that if, tracking is not even setting a goal. Some people may get stuck at even this idea of, I have to set a goal where at the end of the month I have X dollars left over, to put into the savings account. At a minimum, tracking empowers you to understand where your dollars are going. Right? And I'm not of the school of thought that says you can never go to Starbucks or you can never have an avocado toast or whatever the meme of the day is that people shouldn't be spending their money on. Because you also, this is life, and if having that iced coffee is going to bring a smile to your face after you went to 3 different doctor's appointments in one day, then that's okay too. You have to balance life with reality. But if you can track where the dollars are going, and if you can also try to navigate the maze of different resources that may be available, either through your county, through your town, through your state, right, where you can either get some support, maybe school can do an evaluation versus paying for a private evaluation. Any resources that you can tap outside of your own, I think, are helpful. But I think tracking is the very first step in terms of at least understanding what do you have coming in, What do you have going out? And then you can also work with an advisor or work with an accountant to see if you can potentially save taxes, because you probably have a lot of medical expenses. And so maybe there should be some interesting tax or investment planning that you could do at that time.
I was just about to ask about investment planning. Obviously, we see some tax advantage accounts for retirement investment planning. Is there a Roth IRA equivalent for families with children with disabilities who need to save?
So there's not a Roth IRA equivalent, but it's more of what you might consider a 529 college savings plan equivalent, called an ABLE savings account. And so that is an account that you can save into that will grow tax-free. It can be used for qualified disability expenses. Again, sort of a pretty wide range of what it can be used for. And in fact, ABLE plans, unlike special needs trusts, can be used on shelter without impacting SSI. You're limited to the annual exemption amount of gifting to contribute to that. So for this year, that's $18,000. But that can be a tool that can be used. Again, ABLE accounts may be subject to Medicaid payback. So you don't want to necessarily overfund them, and you can't accumulate more than $100,000 without impacting your eligibility for benefits. So it's somewhat limited, but it does have uses in terms of, if you've got some excess savings that you want to set aside, and that's relatively low cost and easy to administer and invest.
And then where does insurance come into play? You mentioned it earlier, and obviously we could probably spend hours talking about insurance, but broad overview, if a family, and I've been using the 2-year-old example, but maybe the diagnosis comes when a child is in their teens or just about to graduate from high school. How do you think about insurance for any of these children?
Yeah, so I am a fan in traditional settings of keeping insurance as low cost as possible and as short term in your plan as you need it to. So in a traditional setting, it's, you buy that low cost term insurance and you save the difference in your premiums and you invest those for the future. Now, when you have someone who has a disability that you need to make sure there's a death benefit to provide for them, come what may down the road, that's where you can start to look at the permanent policies like whole life policies. If you're married, second to die policies can be a little bit more economical. Those permanent policies can be costly. So I think that it is important to sort of balance how much benefit do you actually need versus what do you have saved. Long-term care insurance, while it's also very expensive, and in a lot of cases when you look at it, maybe not very economical to buy because the market has just been so sort of disrupted and mispriced, and now we see a lot of premium increases. The policies are very expensive. But if you have saved for your child and you get into your 80s and have a significant long-term care need, well, your estate could potentially be eroded by long-term care costs for yourself, right? And so again, thinking about insurance as a way to make sure that there's going to be, some amount there for your child, whether that's life insurance or long-term care insurance.
Now, I mentioned at the top of the conversation that you have a very specific designation. You studied for this, the Chartered Special Needs Consultant designation. If a family is caring for a loved one with a disability, should they only be working with financial planners with that designation? Maybe I'm biased, but I would say probably. I think that it's an asset, and what I've heard from clients that I work with is that even if I don't have a magic wand to solve all of their problems, right, the fact that I understand what's happening in their family life, and so much of the decisions that we make about our financial planning they come back to lifestyle and they come back to our goals. And so having someone who can be a sounding board to help you make those types of decisions, having someone who maybe has some connections and network within the community or can point you in the right direction to a local nonprofit who might be able to give you really good guidance. I mean, I think a lot of the work actually as financial planners that we do, right,
managing investments prudently and making sure it's the right time horizon and the right risk tolerance, and that we can create the cash flows that you need. Those are sort of table stakes for any financial planner, right? But where you can take it above and beyond for clients, I think moving forward for a lot of planners is specialization. So whether it's specialization in disability planning or in working with, dentists or in working with business owners, right? I do think that specialization can be helpful because you're partnering with someone to help you make really important decisions.
How do you think your own personal experience with your family helps you interact with clients on a day-to-day basis?
I've been told that I'm very empathetic. And I think that part of my experience has taught me that everyone's situation is truly unique. Mm-hmm. And even if my child has a classmate with the same diagnosis, they're very different children. Right? And so there's really no broad stroke recommendation that you can make to a family that's planning without really understanding their child and what it is, or sibling, mm-hmm. right? It's not always their child. It might be a sibling, it might be a cousin, it might be, someone that you care about. It really has to be a very unique set of recommendations and set of solutions. It's going to depend on the family's resources. It's going to depend on where they live, right? And it's going to depend on the disability itself.
State by state differences in the programs that are available to parents, it's mind-boggling, and I'm sure overwhelming to so many families. Recognizing that every family is different, every child is different, are there frequently asked questions that you've received or that your colleagues with the same designation receive?
I think that it depends. Everyone sort of comes to you from a different starting point. I've met with families who have kids in their 20s and 30s, and they haven't done any estate planning work at all. And so you're sort of starting from scratch in terms of, hey, these are the different types of trusts that are available. What is your plan? What is the life plan for your child? What do you envision for them? Maybe they didn't know what was going to happen. If their child was going to maybe be able to work or not. They tried working. Did it work? Did it not work? Do they need more vocational rehab? It's sort of building a plan from the ground up for an adult child. And so you get sort of all the questions, which are, I don't even know what to ask sort of questions. But I think for most people, really the biggest question is always, have I done everything I could possibly do to make sure that if I'm not around to do this, right, that my child is going to be cared for? Or am I tapping into all the resources that are available? Is there anything that I'm potentially missing? And that's where that partnership with local attorneys who specialize and really understand the public benefit programs at a local level, but also those local nonprofits can be very, very tapped in. And so they can be a great resource.
So if a family is grappling with a new diagnosis, and again, it can happen at any age, and they don't know where to start, is their first step that nonprofit? Is there that first step of their local politician's office? What is the first question and what is the first call?
So when you first get a diagnosis, there's this sort of, what does this mean? Where do I go? I actually had someone ask me who had someone who had their child recently diagnosed, and they said, Melissa, how long did it take you to sort of figure out what you had to do? And I told them it took me several years. This is not a month later after the diagnosis. I understand what these conditions mean, and I know exactly what the latest science and research and the best state-of-the-art treatments and the experimental treatment, right? It's going to take years. I think that it depends on the age that you're getting the diagnosis. I do think working very closely through the IEP process and getting those school supports, because that's where your child is every day, right? That becomes an immediate action step. It was the first thing that we got thrown into. I think it's probably the first thing that a lot of families and parents get thrown into. We didn't even know what an IEP was. Right? So never mind what the laws are and what our rights were and how do you track the goals and are they accomplishing it and what are the repercussions if they don't do what they say they're going to do, right? And so I think sort of if I could turn back time in my own life, because it's hard to speak for other families, if I could turn back time in my own life, the people that were most helpful to me were, education consultants, an education attorney. It's the sort of and to an extent nonprofit, it's the boots on the ground that really understand the practical day-to-day. How do we make the everyday life work? Mm-hmm. And then, of course, there's the more technical financial planning work that also has to come in tandem with that. But you really want to make sure that your child has the right caregivers who are going to support them and understand them. It's where is my child going to be every day, and how do I make sure that that's an optimal situation? It's sort of triage, right, when you first get a diagnosis, because your whole world kind of turns upside down.
And we're talking from the perspective of, obviously, you're a financial planner and a parent, but does most of this process and advice apply if you are a sibling or a cousin or the next closest relative, or is it different if you're not the direct parent?
You mean if you were an adult sibling?
If you're an adult sibling
caregiving?
and your parents are no longer in the picture, so you are the person who is the default caregiver who has to navigate this process.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it this way, right? When you think about all the work that a parent or maybe it's a sibling put into caregiving for someone with a disability, if you take yourself out of that equation, think about all the things that you do for that person on a day-to-day basis. Everything from putting the toothpaste on their toothbrush, because will they do it by themselves or not, right? To driving them, to work, right? To bringing them to their doctor's appointments and advocating for them medically. You really need to think about who the key players are, the many people that you would potentially even have to hire, so that you make sure that there's a team in place for your child. And so that might be, as we sort of fast forward into adulthood, right, it becomes trustees, it becomes case managers who can visit and help with life skills and well checks. It becomes, other advocates and professionals, attorneys, accountants, the sort of more traditional. But you want to make sure that people are communicating, and you do, as to the extent possible, you want to make sure that the person with a disability is involved in their planning, because you don't want to just say, well, here's what I envision for your life, and not get their feedback or not understand what they'd like to accomplish. So a lot of the sort of transition planning, when you go from being a teenager to being an adult, they call it transition planning because you're transitioning out of the entitlement phase of being in school into adulthood, where now you're not entitled to any services whatsoever. You're not entitled. You may be eligible for services, but there are no entitlements, right? And so it becomes a totally different sort of experience, and it does take years of preparation and planning.
This is kind of a broad question, but you work in this space every day. What do you wish the media or the general public better understood or talked about when we talk about families with children with disabilities?
I think that raising awareness is very important. And I also think that because disabilities, I don't know if it's social media or if it's, just the ability to diagnose has improved over years and generations. I actually feel like it's, if you bring up this topic, most people are going to say, I have a sibling, I have a cousin, I have a neighbor, I have a very close friend who needs this type of planning, right? And so I think that just the media raising the awareness that, yes, it's hard, yes, it's complicated, but there are resources and there are people who are specializing in this type of work who want to help, right? We want to help you grow your wealth. We want to help you accomplish your goals. And it's really incredibly meaningful if we can also give you the peace of mind that your loved one who, may need some extra support is also going to be cared for, right? I've heard from families that come to us and they have means, they have resources, they have teams, which is fantastic, and they work hard, they've saved. And the comment in living these very full and busy lives is that caring for my child has just been all-consuming, right? And so I find it enormously fulfilling when I'm able to give someone peace of mind that they've done the work that they need to do. Again, we don't have a magic wand. We can't necessarily cure, I'm not a doctor. I certainly can't cure a disability. A lot of disabilities can't be cured, but we can plan, right? And sometimes planning is empowering. Mm-hmm. It gives you direction, right? It helps you identify where you don't have solutions. It's kind of like that tracking goals and budgeting approach, which is until you actually start to do some form of work on it, you're just sort of muddling along, right? And so I think that the planning is enormously helpful.
It's taking one small step, and
one small step, and also having an accountability partner who's going to ping you every 3 to 6 months and say, hey, how did this project go? How did that project go? Or someone you can call and just say, we've got a bunch of appointments coming up and I don't know what's going to happen with it. Can you hold me accountable to, this is what I wanted to accomplish next month. I'm going to call in and say that I need money for it, but let's talk about it, right? I mean, a lot of the relationships that we build, even though they're based on very formal financial planning, investment management, I mean, we build relationships with our clients where you do know the family, you do, get out to meet the children, and I think especially in instances where there's mental health, I've found having a relationship with a child gives the child a lot of peace of mind that if something happens to mom or dad, I'm going to be okay. Mm-hmm. And mom and dad are setting up a trust for me. Well, what does that mean? What does that say about me? Well, it means mom and dad really care about you, right? And they're doing this for you. And so to have someone who you actually know explaining that, right? We're human beings. Right? And you can connect with people and explain to people, yes, this seems complicated, but this is why we're doing it, and this is how you're going to navigate it, and this is why it's going to be better. Right? And that's really, you want to take the complex and simplify it as much as you can. And if you can't simplify it, I think at least understanding the why of it all, right, helps a lot.
I think it does too. Well, thank you for coming in and helping explain the answers to so many of my questions, and for our audience as well. I know we're all deeply appreciative. So
my
Melissa
pleasure.
Weisz, thank you so much.
Thank you for helping get this message out there. I hope that it's helpful to someone who's listening.
I do too. Thank you.